Good morning. I wanted to share with you this afternoon um, some ideas that I had on a Gemara in Masechah Sukkah. I first started developing this well over 30 years ago and spoke about it at a Simchas Beis HaShoeva at the Kollel in Los Angeles back then. And about 5 years ago, I repeated and added to the shiur here in Baltimore at the Hasidic Kollel on the second night of Sukkos. And hopefully we've improved it a little bit more. And I wanted to share it with my online audience. So the Mishnah says in Masechah Sukkah that if you have a Hadass, a myrtle, on which there are more berries than leaves, it is not permissible for use. A kosher Hadass requires that there are more leaves than berries. But the Mishnah goes on to say that if you pull off the berries until there are fewer berries than leaves, then that would make the Hadass kosher. But the Mishnah concludes, Ve'ein Mema'atin b'yom tov, that on Sukkos itself, you are prohibited from pulling berries off the Hadass. And then the Gemara continues on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Beis and says as follows: Tana Rabbanan, we learned in a brisa, Ein Mima'atin b'yom tov. The first opinion in the brisa says, like the Mishnah said, that we are prohibited from pulling the berries off the Hadass on Yontif itself. However, Mishum Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Shimon Amru, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon, they said, Mima'atin, that it is permissible to pull the berries off the Hadass on Yontif. And the Gemara questions, how could Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Shimon possibly permit pulling the berries off the Hadass on Yontif? V'ham kamisakein mana b'yom tov. You are making the Hadass usable, and taking something which is not fit for use and making it usable is one of the 39 Melachos, the 39 types of work, which would be prohibited whether on Shabbos or Yom Tov. So why in the world would you be permitted to pull berries off of a Hadass on Yontif if you're therefore making the Hadass a usable kosher Hadass? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Ashi Kagon Shalokdan La'achila. Rav Ashi says, you know what the reason is? We're not discussing where you picked the berries off of the Hadass in order to make the Hadass kosher. No, not at all. You were hungry, and you decided you wanted to eat the berries that were on the Hadass. Along the way that you were picking off the berries from the Hadass, you ended up making the Hadass kosher, but your intent of picking the berries was not to make the Hadass kosher, in which case it would be a problem of misakein mana, of making the Hadass usable. No, the reason why you picked the berries off the Hadass was because you were hungry. Now, even though that would be called a davar she'eno miskavein, that you performed the Melacha without intent to perform the Melacha, again, because your intent was to eat. Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Shimon savar lo ka'avuha, because Rabbi Eliezer b'Rabbi Shimon shares the same opinion as his father. The Amar davar she'ein miskavein mutter, who says that if you do a Melacha without intent to do the Melacha, that is permissible on Shabbos. And that's a big machlokas in Masechah Shabbos. We're not going to get into the whole machlokas now, but suffice it to say, we're saying Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Shimon, goes along with his father's opinion that since your intent was to eat the berries, the fact that it comes along with making the Hadass kosher, that's not a problem on Yontif. But the Gemara says that still is a problem, because Abaye v'Rava da Amri Tarvayu, because both Abaye and Rava say that Moder Rabbi Shimon, that Rabbi Shimon, even though he holds that a davar she'eno miskavein, an unintentional melacha, is permissible on Shabbos or Yantiv, But Rabbi Shimon would agree, b'psik reshe v'lo yamos. Psik reshe v'lo yamos is an idiom that means that if the unintentional melacha is inevitable, then even Rabbi Shimon would agree that it's prohibited. It's only a davar she'eino miskaven if you're trying to do one thing and the melacha could end up happening, maybe won't happen. Then if it happens, Rabbi Shimon would say that's a davar she'eino miskaven and it is mutter, it's permissible. But over here, we're picking off the berries is inevitably going to create a kosher hadass, then even Rabbi Shimon would agree that it's prohibited. So we're back to the question, how could there be an opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon, permitting you to go ahead and pick the berries off the hadass, even if your intention is to eat them in order to make and therefore make the hadass kosher on Yantif. And the Gemara concludes, Hacha b'mai askinan. What are the circumstances that we are discussing over here? The isle hoshana achriti. In this case, we are discussing where the person already has a kosher hadassim. And since he already has kosher hadassim, so he doesn't need these. So what? So what if he has kosher hadassim, but he's making these hadassim kosher as well? So let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi says something which is a tremendous chiddush. Rashi says, Lo tzricha de isle hoshana achriti. Rashi says it's talking about where the person has another hadass. V'lo tzarech lahai. He doesn't need this hadass which he's making kosher by pulling off the berries on Yantif. And since he doesn't need it, hilkach ein kan tikun kli. Pulling off the berries and therefore creating a kosher hadass is not called making something usable on Yantif because you have no need for this hadass, since you already have an adequate number of kosher hadassim. He doesn't need this hadass. He doesn't need to kosherize this hadass. It's not similar to a case where the melacha is inevitable. The hasam over there, again, literally the word psik reshe, even though we translate as inevitable, literally means a person says, I'm going to chop off the head of the chicken, but I don't mean to make it die. Well, obviously, if you're chopping off its head, you know it's going to die. But over here, in this case, since he has no need for the hadass, it's not like a case of psik reshe. The hasam over there, ika netilas neshama memanavshach. Because over there, chopping off the head of an animal, the melacha is taking a life. And you're taking a life. Whether or not you need the life to be taken, you're taking a life. But v'hacha over here, leka tikun kli, since he already has an adequate number of hadassim, making this hadass kosher is not considered to be making something usable because he has no need for it whatsoever. Aval ilo havi achriti, but let's say he didn't have other hadassim to use, then it would be considered to be mashvi le mana. It would be considered to be that he is turning this into a kli, he's turning this into a usable object, because he needs this. Va'af agav delo miskave lahachi aser. And even if he didn't intend, it would still be prohibited since it's inevitable and he needs it. So we're going to discuss in a few minutes exactly what is the logic behind Rashi's reasoning. What does Rashi mean when he says that determining whether or not this is a melacha depends on whether or not you need it? And Rashi's distinguishing that by a hadass, if you don't need this hadass and you're picking off the berries to eat them, then it's not considered to be a melacha. As opposed to chopping off the head of a chicken is a melacha, whether or not you're thinking or wanting it to be a melacha. So why is it that when it comes to koshering the hadass, it depends on your need for it? We'll talk about that soon. But first, I want to address a different issue, frankly, a bit of a technical issue. And the issue is as follows. In the Gemara's conclusion, that the Gemara said that it's talking about where the person has a Hoshana Achriti. He already has other kosher Hadassim and doesn't need this. So the wording of the Gemara was, Hacha b'may askinan. What are we talking about over here? We're talking about the Islay Hoshana Achriti, that he has another Hoshana. I'm going to point out to you something interesting. In Rashi, in the Dibur HaMaschil of Rashi, Rashi uses a slightly different wording. Rather than saying, Hacha b'may askinan, what are we speaking about over here? Rashi uses the term lo tzricha, the Islay Hoshana Achriti. So what does this phrase lo tzricha mean? So there's a quite old sefer called Halichos Olam. There's actually a number of different sfarim that have been written over the years on Klolei Hashas, on how to understand and the usage of Talmudic idioms. The Halichos Olam was written by somebody who was one of the Mugurashe Sfard, who was exiled in the time of the Spanish Inquisition. And he wrote a sefer, Halichos Olam, which is one of the most important sfarim ever written on Klolei Hashas. Actually, interestingly, and again, not very well known, the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, even wrote a commentary on it. And when he comes to explain the phrase lo tzricha, let's step back for a minute. What does that mean, lo tzricha? So I'm going to start with the second explanation that he gives, and then we'll go to the first explanation. He explains that really, in his second explanation, the phrase lo tzricha is really a phrase the Gemara should use whenever there was a question that there was an unnecessary statement. In other words, we see in the Gemara oftentimes the Gemara will ask, Pshita, why are you teaching me this? Isn't this obvious? And the Gemara will answer, Lo, no, it's not obvious. Tzricha, this is why it's necessary. So that explanation does not seem to fit over here in the Gemara whatsoever. He brings down another explanation. Actually, by him, it's the first explanation, in which he says that lo tzricha is basically means the exact same thing as hacha b'may askinan. That no, you have to say this is what we're talking about over here. So in that case, even though the Gemara said hacha b'may askinan, and Rashi said lo tzricha, according to the first explanation, the Halichos Olam, you would have to say that those two phrases basically mean the same thing. You want to know what we're talking about? We're talking about the Islay Hoshana Achriti, that he has another Hoshana, and therefore, as Rashi explained, it doesn't constitute a Melacha. However, one of the commentaries on the Yavin Shmua, written by either the grandfather or the great-grandfather of the Chidah, he rejects this, and he understands that the term lo tzricha does not mean the same thing as hacha b'may askina. What are we talking about over here? So that doesn't mean the same thing. And so therefore he says you have to find some other way of explaining the phraseology. And he brings in an interesting example, where the Gemara talks about in Be'ah that you can't get married on Yontif. And the Gemara asks, V'ha mitzvah ka'avid, but you're doing a mitzvah. So why would we prohibit someone from getting married on Yontif? And the Gemara says, Lo tzricha de islay isha ubanim. Now again, according to the Halichos Olam, you would say lo tzricha means hacha b'may askinan. What are we talking about when we say that you can't get married on Yontif? It has to be someone who already is married and already has children. But the Yavin Shmua doesn't like that. And so Yavin Shmuel gives a very interesting explanation. He says that when the Gemara says lo tzricha, the Gemara is saying, no, he's not doing a mitzvah by getting married in Yontif, because lo tzricha, he doesn't need to get married because he's already married and he already has a family. And so therefore getting married for him is unnecessary. And so therefore I want to suggest that you could apply the same reading in our Gemara. That when the Gemara answers lo tzricha de isle hoshana achriti, you can read the words lo tzricha as saying he doesn't need this Hadass whose berries he is picking off. Why not? Because he already has a kosher Hadass. So that's two possible explanations so far to understand the Gemara's answer. Either lo tzricha is like a hacha b'mayaskin, and what are we talking about over here? Or it means simply lo tzricha is not going on the author of the brisa, that this is what he was talking about, but rather it's going on the Hadass and saying he doesn't need the Hadass. Why not? Because he already has another Hadass. But I want to offer a third possible approach to understanding the Gemara. Because when the Gemara began, the Gemara started off by saying, how can you pick the berries on Yom Tif? Aren't you creating a kli? Aren't you taking something that is unusable and making it usable on Yom Tif, which would be a Melacha? And the Gemara went through a whole explanation. Okay, it's a psik reisha. Yes, it's a davar she'eino miskaven. It's unintentional. Yes, it is a Melacha, but it's unintentional, etc. In the end, when the Gemara says the isle hoshana achriti, that he already has other kosher hadassim, so according to Rashi, the answer is that it is not a Melacha whatsoever. So whereas the Gemara, throughout 7 or 8 lines of the Gemara was assuming that picking off the berries constitutes a Melacha, a forbidden type of work on Yom Tif, but there might be another reason why it's permissible. And then all of a sudden at the end, the Gemara reverses course according to Rashi, and is saying it does not even constitute a Melacha whatsoever. And the Kapos Tumarim and a number of the other commentators are bothered by this, because there is no place in the Gemara in which you see the Gemara reversing course. Just let me pause for a moment to answer a question. Over here, the Hadassim were already cut off the bush prior to Yontif, so picking the fruit off of the stem would not be a problem on Yontif. So the question is, you don't see in the Gemara any place where the Gemara makes it clear that it's reversing course. So where in the world in the Gemara do you see the Gemara changing from its initial assumption that we're dealing with something that is a Melacha to all of a sudden changing course completely and saying, nope, not a Melacha whatsoever? So I want to suggest that that might be a third possible reason. Because generally speaking, when the Gemara changes course, we'll usually find the Gemara introducing the change in course with the word Ella. Ella would mean rather. You've been assuming X, Y, Z until now. Ella, rather, this is the way to understand it. But again, with Rashi's phrase of lo tzricha, it could also serve the same purpose. You could understand that the Gemara is answering lo, no. Don't assume that what is going on over here constitutes a Melacha, and therefore you're having a number of questions on it. Tzricha, you have to say that it's not a Melacha, the isle hoshana achriti, because of the fact that he has another Hadass, another kosher Hadass already, and he doesn't need this one. So that's 3 possible approaches as to how to understand the Gemara's answer. But we're still left with a question over here that, so what? You don't need this Hadass. But why don't we still say that the very act of picking the berries off the Hadass and when you're done, you're creating a kosher Hadass. That's a Melacha, that's a prohibited behavior on Yontif, whether or not you need it. So the Chassam Sofer brings down a very interesting explanation. And he bases it on a Rambam. And the Chassam Sofer says as follows: Yesh Melachos, there are certain types of work that are prohibited on Shabbos and Yom Tov, she'inyan ha-melacha tolui biritzono, that the aspect of whether or not it's considered to be a melacha depends on what the person wants. And he gives an example from the Rambam. The Rambam says that if you take a twig on Yontif and you sharpen it in order to use it as a toothpick, that would be considered to be a melacha. On the other hand, if you would just be taking the same twig, and just be playing around with it, okay, just some nervous habit that you have, okay, you can't find your fidget toy, so you're busy scratching at the top of this twig on Yontif, and when you're done, you end up creating something which is fit to use as a toothpick, that is not considered to be a melacha whatsoever. Because you had no intention to create a toothpick. All you were doing is playing around. And if you're just playing around with the toothpick, even though what you did create it with, with the twig, even though you did created a toothpick, only if you need a toothpick is that a melacha. But if you don't need a toothpick, then all you're doing is fooling around with a twig. And therefore the Chassam Sofer says that according to Rabbi Eliezer or Rabbi Shimon, it would be the same thing over here. That it isn't true that pulling berries off of a Hadass is under any circumstance or under all circumstances considered to be a melacha. Because at the end of the day, you have a kosher Hadass. It all depends in a case like that on what were you trying to accomplish. If the pulling off of the berries from the Hadass were simply because you were hungry, then and you have no need whatsoever for a Hadass, then there's no melacha whatsoever. All you're doing is simply eating berries. But if you are pulling the berries off for eating and you need a Hadass, then that would constitute a Melacha. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to wish everybody a very good Moed.